right, so this is our last summer meeting, so glad y'all are here. The faithful remnant that's made it through the summer. So hopefully you've enjoyed the series, Essential Christian Doctrine with Norm Geisler. If you weren't able to catch all of it, you can always go back to the YouTube page. I think we got all of it, right? Yep. We videoed all of them. The audio at the very beginning with Christian was very sketchy, but we've upped our audio game massively with the wireless Bluetooth mic. Yeah. So you can hear every gasp and sigh and everything from Josh.
Yes, today. It's going to be shocking.
But yeah, tonight is our last one. Glad to have Josh Knautz back. He did an awesome job when he spoke this past year about the relationship between Israel and the church. Had a lot of positive feedback about that.
Awesome.
I think I told you that. But yeah, Josh came up through the Ratio ranks, through Cape Fear Community College, up through UNCW, and now we're so proud of our little boy. He's grown up and he's doing great things.
Yes.
But yeah, tonight he's going to be speaking on the intercessory ministry of Christ and also the second coming. So, Josh?
That's right. Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Grant, for clapping for me. My name's Josh Knautz. I'm a pastor of a local house church, Church of the Risen Christ, with Grant Forrester. House church that was actually born out of Ratio Christi when I was a student here back in the day. I'm the husband to my lovely wife Lindsay, a father to the 3 precious children she gave me. I'm also a travel ER ICU nurse, so my schedule stays pretty full these days, but I am glad I get the opportunity to speak to you. I got the opportunity, as Tom said, to speak in the spring about the relationship between the church and Israel. And thinking that I didn't have a controversial enough topic the first time, Tom thought I should come back and talk about the second coming of Christ. I'm only kidding, because this summer series, as I understand it, is the essentials of the faith, and I'm looking to steer mostly clear of the controversial parts and stick to the stuff that most people can agree on. And on that, I've actually been given a pretty easy assignment, because the 2 topics that I've been given tonight, Christ's priestly intercession and Christ's second coming, are in relative agreement amongst orthodoxy, and I'll explain that more. And the disagreements tend to come from cultic camps and camps determined to be otherwise outside of orthodoxy. But before we even get into those topics, I would like to take the opportunity to drive home a point that I find deeply personal, and this summer series seems to fit right along with, which is the unity of the body of Christ. At our church, we just got done teaching through the book of Ephesians, and this topic is a central theme of the book. Paul talks about the mystery of the church age is that Jew and Gentile can come together in unity because we have a transcendent shared identity now. That above our ethnic, religious, and cultural disputes, we are all followers of Christ, and that should transcend those other identities and keep us closer together. The example that I use at church is that you might not have anything in common with the governing philosophy of California. I may not identify as ideologically aligned with Californians, but transcending that distinction is our shared identity as Americans. And this identity transcends lower state level identities. And this means that we can argue all we want about the governing strategies of the states, but if California was under attack from enemies abroad, we would have to unite and stand beside them, because we are all Americans after all. And that identity transcends the lower level ones. And it is this central shared identity as Christ followers that Paul implores us to let it unite us above our differences. And as we talk about the essentials of the faith, can we take an opportunity to tap into an ecumenical spirit, a spirit of uniting the church, a spirit like Jesus said that his disciples would be known for their radical love for each other? Can we recognize that our shared identity as Christians and the things that we do agree upon way transcend the things that we disagree upon? This can drive genuine unity. And I'm as critical as anyone else of false unity, of we don't stand for anything so that we can cast as wide a net as possible for everyone to fit sort of unity. That's a fragile unity. That's not sustainable. But if we can unite around the robust doctrines of the faith, we can create a genuine unity. Part of the reason that this is such a struggle in the church is that it is not so much a theological problem, but a character problem within the church. We so struggle to disagree with grace. Have we not learned anything from Paul? There was no one more theologically robust than the Pharisees in Jesus' time. They were likely the best thinkers of their time, the most studied and the most compliant to the traditions of the faith. But not only did they miss Jesus, they persecuted him and his followers, and instead of a kingdom with Christ as the head, they got the diaspora. They got the destruction of the temple, the dispersion. And Paul, a trained Pharisee under Gamaliel, one of the most prestigious teachers of Israel, Paul, a brilliant mind and zealous for the faith, but his lack of open-mindedness to the Messiah, Jesus, caused him to do something he forever regretted, which was to persecute and have killed the members of the early church. But not every Pharisee missed Jesus in his time. The New Testament gives us a primary example of a Pharisee who did not miss Jesus. His name was Nicodemus, and he did not lack for theological rigor. Jesus calls him the teacher of Israel, meaning he was likely the head of a major theological seminary type thing in Israel at the time. He was the Al Mohler of Israel. But he knew enough to know what he didn't know. And he came to Jesus with humility, asking questions like Jesus might actually have something to teach him. It is his open-mindedness and humility that made him not miss the moment when Jesus came. Could we, as the church, tap into the spirit of Nicodemus? Not a lack of theological rigor, having a robust theology, but an open-mindedness that not all those who come with a different perspective are wolves or false teachers or simple-minded and foolish, but that we're all finite creatures wrestling to conceptualize an infinite God. And if he could fit into our brains, he really would be a much smaller God than he actually is. Can we please learn a lesson from the generation that will forever be known as the generation that missed Jesus? They were a generation fighting amongst themselves, Jews alike, under Roman occupation. Yet the Sadducees trained their fire at the Pharisees, and the Pharisees at the Sadducees, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees at Jesus and his followers, and fought amongst themselves and literally used the levers of the Roman occupying force, bowing the knee to Caesar in order to persecute Jesus. They only fought with one another instead of realizing that the power and control of all of their institutions is a pagan occupying force. At the center of their disunity was a theological question, but fundamentally, a lack of humility and open-mindedness made the truth unable to present itself in a way that they could see. They trained their fire at each other instead of uniting against the pagan force occupying all of their institutions. Does any of that sound familiar? United, the church could be the most powerful voting bloc in this country, making demands that the politicians could not refuse. United, we could empty out the foster care system in this country with ease. We could take back the charitable intermediary institutions that the government has taken from us and used to leverage votes for themselves. We could train our fire at the pagan occupying force instead of at one another. Yet we are so divided that we can't mobilize, leaving us impotent. Christians within the sound of my voice, can we agree to thinking twice before we fire shots across the bow at fellow Christians? Can we all agree that many of our disagreements are on secondary issues? And if we will major on the majors and minor on the minors, we could actually mobilize a church to do powerful things. That the unity is more important than everyone passing the purity test constructed by our various traditions before we partner in ministry with them. I fully believe that downstream from theology you find your practice. I understand that theological difference produce practical differences. But can we just for a second understand that we have more practical differences with the pagan occupiers than we do with fellow Christians of different traditions? There will be traditions putting themselves outside of the essential doctrine of the faith. And we perhaps have seen the utter collapse of one of these denominations within the last year. But the might of a unified church that seeks to conserve the orthodox, essential doctrines of the faith could be a force to be reckoned with, and it starts with us. It starts with each of us choosing overwhelming unity over minor disagreements and stop firing on each other instead of taking aim at the key issues facing us in the culture that we live. Can we evaluate other Christians based on the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, rather than total theological compliance to our chosen tradition? Or are we going to wait until we have total doctrinal unanimity and be the generation that misses Jesus? Amen? Amen. Thank you. With that, let's get into one of these central unifying Christian doctrines, which is that we have a high priest in Jesus Christ. So, Christ's priestly intercession. Hebrews 4:14. If you want to follow along, if you have your Bibles, I'll be kind of hopping from verse to verse. I'll call it out, and you can pull it up if you want to. I'll read it aloud. Hebrews 4:14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We're going to spend some time in the book of Hebrews for the priestly intercession portion, because who was the book of Hebrews written to? Anybody? Hebrews. Wasn't a trick question. And to whom was the priestly system given? The Levites. More broadly, the Hebrews. But yes, the Levites. The author of Hebrews is writing to Jews who have accepted Yeshua, the Messiah, but because of cultural pressures and other pressures, are considering going back to the Levitical system, back under the priestly system. And the author of Hebrews does not spend his time telling the Jews that their religion and cultural desires have aged out and to not worry about them. Rather, he takes things that are central to the religious traditions of the Jews and tries to communicate that Jesus is all the things that they long for, only better. What do we gather from Hebrews 4 that I just read? That the high priestly role has passed away? No. That rather, the high priest of all high priests has come. That we now have a great high priest. The things that the high priest had traditionally done for the congregation of Israel have not disappeared or have been made not necessary, but rather this role has been fulfilled to the highest degree by Jesus Christ. Not fulfilled as in done away with, like we so often use that phrase, in my view, incorrectly. Jesus did not fulfill the high priestly system, meaning that he did away with it. He fulfilled the high priestly system by becoming the great high priest, achieving the merits of that system to the highest degree. Jesus did not fulfill the law by doing away with it. Jesus fulfilled the law by keeping it perfectly, achieving the merits of the law to the highest degree. Like a cup filled fully, Jesus fulfilled the law by keeping it perfectly. Thusly, he achieved the merits of the law. The law was set up so that if it were kept perfectly, the merits of the law would be total righteousness. But knowing that we could not keep it perfectly, it was given to us to demonstrate our sinfulness. But for the Messiah, the law was given so that he may achieve perfect righteousness. It is the same with the high priestly system. Jesus fulfilled it by becoming the merits of it, which is the great high priest. And what was the high priest made to do? Hebrews 5, verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sin, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So the high priests, after the order of Aaron, were meant to represent man to God, to come into the presence of God and offer gifts and sacrifices, not only for themselves and their own sinfulness, but as a representative, carrying the weight of the sins of the people of Israel and offering sacrifices as payment for sins. So how did Jesus become the great high priest? He became in himself the perfect sacrifice. With that sacrifice, not paying for his own sins, but the sins of the people. He then went into the throne room of God, the most holy place, and applied the blood of that sacrifice to whosoever believes. And because his blood is so powerful, and since he does not sin, he made that sacrifice once and for all. Hebrews 6:19. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The priests of Aaron were many because they were mortal and time-bound, but the high priesthood of Christ is eternal. It is also holy, innocent, I wrote untrained here, but I don't think that's what I meant to write. That is innocent, I believe. Consecrated and exalted. Hebrews 7:23 will make this case for me without the spelling error, hopefully. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost, to those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained. That's what I was trying to write, not untrained. That makes more sense. But we should have a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sin and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So to recap what we have established, what Jesus has fulfilled in our talk today. He's fulfilled the law and the high priesthood. He fulfilled it by achieving the highest merits that they offer. The law offered righteousness to the one who kept it perfectly, and by perfectly fulfilling the law, Christ earned the righteousness that came through it in our temporal realm. And Christ took righteousness into his hand like a possession and said, now that I have earned and paid for this possession on the cross, I will distribute righteousness to whosoever I decide. And Christ decided that it was to whosoever believes that he was going to give the righteousness to. And since that he could now grant his followers righteousness, there was no longer any need for the veil in the temple. God's people were now suitable to be made into a temple and a holy of holies. And then, as our high priest, he ascended to the presence of God, where Hebrews says that he always lives to make intercession for us. And when he ascended, he brought the Holy of Holies to each of us by sending the Holy Spirit to dwell within us. But Hebrews says something else that is very interesting about the kind of high priest that Jesus is. He is not a high priest after the order or kind or likeness of Aaron. Aaron was the brother of Moses. He was the first high priest of the law of Moses. He was not God's first high priest, but he was the first of the Levitical law. And the priests after him were his sons, and were priests in his likeness after the order of Aaron. But Jesus was a high priest, but not a son of Aaron, not in his likeness. The sons of Aaron were of the tribe of Levi. They were Levites, like Tom said. But Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, meaning that he is a different kind of high priest. He is a high priest after the order of who? Melchizedek. What does that mean? Who was Melchizedek? And why was Jesus a priest after his order? Melchizedek is a controversial figure. He only makes a brief appearance, and it is shrouded in some mystery. Hebrews gives us a brief synopsis of Melchizedek and his meeting with Abraham in the Old Testament, as he was a contemporary of Abraham. Hebrews 7:1 gives us this synopsis. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth of everything. He is first, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues as a priest forever. So it's kind of mysterious even in that description. But Abraham meets this man, and he's a high priest of the Most High God. Was this man of the law? No, the law hadn't been given yet. Was this man a high priest of the Jews? No, he was a contemporary of Abraham, the father of the nation. His name is Melchi, meaning king, and Zedeki, meaning righteousness in the Semitic languages of the day. That was his name, Melchizedek, and his title was Melchishalom. Melchi meaning king, Shalom, or Salem as it's translated, meaning peace. He was the king of righteousness, and he was king of a city called Shalom, or Salem as it's translated. By the way, we can talk in brief about another title or role that Jesus fulfilled. He became the heir to the throne of David, the Davidic king. It is no coincidence that David was the king of what city? What is the city of the great king? Jerusalem. In Hebrew, Yerushalom, river of peace. Melchizedek was the king of Shalom, Salem, an actual city named Peace. Jesus would later be the Davidic king of Yerushalom, an actual city, the river of peace. Melchizedek was the king of Shalom, and Jesus the king of Yerushalom. These two figures, Melchizedek and Messiah, are inextricably linked. And even later in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, after the giving of the law and the high priests of Aaron, they still predicted that another high priest was coming, not of the order of Aaron, but of the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110, verses 2 and 4. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. rule in the midst of your enemies. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That was a prophecy of a coming high priest, not like the high priest of Aaron, but one like Melchizedek. And it is on that theme that the author of Hebrews is picking up on. So what have we learned about the prophesied high priest after the order of Melchizedek? He was not a priest of the Levitical law, but rather pre-existed it. He was not a priest representing the Jewish people, but rather pre-existed them. He was the king of peace, the king of righteousness, greater than even Abraham. It says, Hebrews talks all about the fact that Melchizedek is the one who blesses Abraham, and the greater blesses the lesser, and that Abraham gives a tenth, he gives a tithe of all of his belongings to Melchizedek because he was greater than even Abraham, the great patriarch. And it says he was to be a high priest forever. It talks about not having beginning of days or end of days or genealogy. People take that different ways. Some people make that to seem that he's eternal, which would make him a Christ figure or a theophany in the Old Testament. Some people just say that his genealogy is not recorded. We never hear of where he came from or where he went. We don't see the beginning of his life or the end of his life, and in that way, he kind of symbolically continues on forever because there is another priest coming after his order. And so however you take that, that's not necessarily the most important thing, but what it's driving at is this picture, what the author of Hebrews is driving at is this picture of his priesthood continuing on forever. And so I'll leave you in this section with this verse, 1 John 2:1. My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin, but if anyone does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. So, our great high priest after the order of Melchizedek is not the Levitical priest of the law. He's not a priest only for the Jewish people. He is the king of righteousness. He is the king of peace. And he is a priest that continues on forever. And he is advocating on our behalf at the right hand of the Father, always living to make intercession for us, so that if anyone does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. Amen? You guys with me? No. All right.
Well, we're certainly not against you.
All right. Appreciate that. Okay, with that, we'll move on into the second topic, which is the second coming of Christ. Acts 1, verse 9. Well, I guess, hold on, before I get into that, I think it's a small enough group. We'll treat it like a house church service here. Did anybody have any comment that they wanted to make or clarifying anything on the high priest stuff before we leave this? Oh, Grant's question is going to be way too hard. I'm going to pick somebody else.
No, I was just going to pick on you. Do you think Melchizedek is a theophany or a real guy?
I think he's a real guy.
Okay.
Yeah. But I could be wrong. Open to having my mind changed on it. It is weird that they describe him as having no beginning or genealogy or end. That does sound like not a person of this world. But I think there's merit to the idea that he's describing them not recording those things, and in fact that there was the idea that there's another one coming in his order presupposes that it's different from the first one. And so anyway, there's a big discussion about that. If you want a detailed argument, read Fruitenbaum. He's the one who informed my opinion on that one. You'll get there eventually, Dom. Yeah.
What is the scene of Christ interceding for us? So is when we sin, is he, praying to the Father on our behalf? What
Yeah,
You know,
that's a great
the drama of it, I guess.
that's a great question.
And I'll follow up on that because I was gonna ask.
You needed that question to be harder than it already was.
No, just to expand it a little bit. But yeah, the Hebrews 7:25 about Jesus being able to save to the uttermost, where the footnote says completely or at all times, those who draw near to him, near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. In my mind, that's one of the, I've pointed to that verse for perseverance of the saints.
Mm-hmm.
That Jesus is interceding for us, kind of like he did for Peter, praying that Peter wouldn't fail,
Yeah.
and that he's able to save to the uttermost, or save completely, or at all times.
Yeah.
Do you read that the same way?
Yeah.
And kind of, is that how you see an aspect of his intercessory?
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to bring up, was when he talks to Peter about he's praying for him to strengthen him, which is kind of weird because you're thinking, okay, this is the God of everything. He can just make happen whatever it is that he wants to make happen. But the prayers of a righteous man avails much, and the prayers of a perfect man, I would imagine, are extremely powerful. And that's what he points to say, I'm just going to pray for you that you would actually persevere on. And so I kind of see the intercessory role is like an ongoing thing, like he's on your behalf praying for you, and this is part of the sanctifying work that goes on. But the scene, I like to think of the scene as like a courtroom sort of drama, because we have Hasatan is the adversary. Satan, in Hebrew, Hasatan is literally the prosecutor. It's the guy who's bringing the accusation against you. And so you see scenes in Zechariah, beginning of Zechariah, you see it where Hasatan and, is it Zechariah or Zephaniah? I can't remember. You see Hasatan coming against Joshua the high priest, and as they're coming to build like the second temple, and you see him as the accuser, and then there's this other figure that's like against Hasatan in this courtroom drama, saying that he's not guilty of the things that you're accusing him of, sort of deal. And so you kind of see this courtroom drama sort of play out with the accuser on the one side and the advocate on the other side. And I sort of see, as you read 1 John 2:1, that if anybody does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense. And that seems like a defense attorney almost, like he's advocating for us in a continual way because of his righteousness, that it's continual advocacy and prayer. So that's kind of how I see it, but who knows? Grant, does that satiate your, that's in your realm there?
We're getting ready to do a bunch of episodes on Satan, so it's fresh on mine.
Yeah.
The Hasatan is the Satan.
Yeah.
The accuser, the adversary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That is interesting, Graham, because I actually kind of forgot about Satan when I was thinking about this 2 minutes ago.
Yeah.
I was thinking about God being the accuser, I suppose. Like, I don't know. In my head, I kind of had like, we sin, God's furious. He's just like, oh, but he's righteous. He has my righteousness.
Right. Well, and
Well, there are times in the Old Testament where God does do that.
Yeah.
There are times where God even calls himself. Like, go read Numbers. I'll have to find them, but it almost looks like a contradiction. I think it's 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Where one of the stories, it says that Satan, Satan, had incited David to take the census that God was going to judge Israel for. And then in the version of that same story in Chronicles, it says that God incited David to take the census. And God is Satan. And so there are times where God does do that, but usually it's through the form of the angel of the Lord who's playing that role, and not necessarily God the Father.
as in like carrying out the just reward for sin.
Being the adversary to someone, like so.
That's sinning.
The angel of the Lord calls himself a Satan when he faces Balaam with the donkey story.
Mm.
It's like it is a lot like a courtroom.
Yeah.
Up in the heavenlies, like when there's somebody that sort of is being focused on the conversation, the church as a whole, Israel as a whole, whatever, an individual. That certainly is something that we see in the Scripture.
Right. And you kind of see that play out in a courtroom too, because the prosecutor isn't always incorrectly prosecuting. You know, sometimes he's doing exactly what he's supposed to do, which is to seek the just retribution for sin and unrighteousness and criminality and wickedness and all these things. And then there's the defense attorney that's like trying to advocate for his client, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. But when it comes to Christ, he actually has paid the penalty for anybody who he represents. And so he can be a true advocate for all sin, for whosoever believes and would accept his advocacy against all accusation, whether rightly placed or incorrectly placed. Christ can be the advocate for that because he's paid for it, you know.
This is a bit of a rant, but I don't know, it makes me think of like Psalm 82 with the judgment of the gods,
Mm-hmm.
like the council. I can almost think of it as like several of the sons of God. I don't know, Grant filled in a lot of gaps and it's all being like, he did this, he did that, but Jesus is Yahweh, so he's the head of the council anyway. And it's like, shut up.
Yeah, right.
It's the court.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like I see him, he's as righteous as me. Like, oh, you're not.
Right. And that's pretty cool. But yeah, that does.
Fictionalized,
It does.
but
It does.
council's still there anymore. I don't get it.
It does kind of play out either like a courtroom or like what's that in Star Wars, that big the Senate. Yeah, that's that's kind of how it plays out in my mind. So anyway, any other thoughts or questions before we move on to the second coming? Cool.
Wait, we're going to the second coming?
It's
It's
now.
happening right now?
It's yes.
I thought you were going to be.
No one knows the times or the seasons except for me. It's the special Jewish insight I
A lot of
get.
people be happy about that.
How's that?
A lot of people be happy.
Yes, yeah. Acts 1:9. And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he, Jesus, was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven, as he went, behold, two men standing by them in white robes, and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who is taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. So now we stumble into something a little more controversial, but remember our emphasis on unity and ecumenism, and remember that this is an essentials of the faith lecture, meaning there are many and diverse views about the second coming of Jesus. I'll mention the categories, not exhaustively, but rather we'll focus kind of on what we mostly agree on as essential doctrine. And to this end, I will quote from Geisler. He says, while significant differences exist among Christians regarding the end times, the key characteristics of historic Christianity's essential beliefs about the end times include the following. 1, a literal return of Christ to the earth to end the dominion of sin and bring in righteousness and peace. 2, the separation of humankind into two groups forever, wherein A, the saved will enjoy conscious eternal life, and B, the lost will be condemned to suffer conscious everlasting doom. And 3, in conjunction with point 2, there will be a bodily resurrection of all the saved and the unsaved, and the saved will undergo a personal transformation into a state of perfect and permanent righteousness. Orthodoxy on this topic would affirm the expectation of the bodily return of Christ to earth, the bodily resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous, and the judgment of them and the establishment of the eternal state, the new heavens and the new earth. That's broadly Christian orthodoxy on the topic. This definition would exclude, as orthodox, a view called full preterism. I want to introduce you to the three categories of thought relating to the prophecies of the end times and of the second coming. There's three categories of thought broadly about the prophecies. And then I will introduce three categories of thought as it relates to the timing of the second coming. So 3 categories in reference to the prophecies, and then 3 categories in regards to the timing of the second coming. These will not be exhaustive, and I will try to be charitable and fair with my treatment of these thoughts. I'm going to try to not even have you know which one I believe, though if you were here for the Israel lecture, you probably have a pretty good idea. So I'm just going to try to get everybody kind of up to speed on the conversations that are happening around these topics. So in regard to the prophecies of the second coming, the 3 categories would be preterism, partial preterism, and futurism. These are broad and somewhat diverse categories, but the names refer to when we think the prophecies of the second coming are to be fulfilled. When the prophecies are to be fulfilled. Preterism comes from a Latin word meaning past. So when would a preterist expect the prophecies of the second coming to be fulfilled? In the past, meaning from our vantage today, they would be in the past. They think those prophecies have already happened, and that there is not prophecy yet future. In its purest form, the Judgment Day took place in 70 AD. There is no yet future Great Commission. There is no yet future second coming of Christ, physical resurrection, or establishment of the new heavens and new earth. The events of Revelation have already taken place. This view necessitates not only Revelations, the book, to be written before 70 AD, but every book of the New Testament, because the prophecies of those books would have to come to pass with the destruction of the temple by the Roman Empire in 70 AD. This is not broadly the aging of those books, and when they were written being before 70 AD is not broadly the consensus among scholars. It would have to insist, preterism, that the resurrection, whether in their minds physical or spiritual, would have to have taken place by 70 AD as well. This view does not appear to comport with the resurrection expectations of the second generation disciples writing after the destruction of the temple. So we have the first generation disciples and the disciples made disciples. Some of these names will be very familiar to you as Theo nerds. You'll know some of these names, but they're the disciples of Christ.
Church fathers.
And they were writing after 70 AD. The first one I'll reference is Clement of Rome, writing at the end of the 1st century AD. Let us consider, beloved, how the Master continually proves to us that there will be a future resurrection. This clearly references a future resurrection after 70 AD. This name, I'm going to butcher. Hegesippus?
Spell it.
Hegesippus?
Josh?
I think it's Hegesippus.
Hegesippus? That seems as good as any. Writing in the 2nd century, speaks of the grandsons of Judah, which I think is kind of cool. I didn't really realize that we had recorded legacy of Judah's grandchildren. But he quoted the grandchildren of Jude to say, quote, "It would be at the end of the world when he would come in glory to judge the living and the dead and to reward every man according to his deeds." This references a future judgment post 70 AD. Ignatius, writing at roughly the same time, early 2nd century, he said, "He was raised from the dead when his Father raised him up, as in the same manner his Father shall raise up in Christ Jesus us, who believe in him, without whom we have no true life." So he references a future and bodily resurrection, not a spiritual one, but one physical like that of Jesus. Polycarp, thought to be a disciple of the Apostle John, writing at the same time, he says, "Whosoever perverts the oracles of the Lord for his own lusts, and says that there is neither resurrection nor judgment, this man is the firstborn of Satan." Which is obviously a pretty strong statement to expect some things yet future, at least for his perspective, post 70 AD fall of the temple. This was just a quick treatment of preterism, as there's simply no time to deal with all of it. However, as we look at the other views, as they make their affirmative case, if they're compelling, then preterism must not be true because they are in direct contradiction. Preterism is generally thought by most to be an unorthodox view, and in the treatment of the essentials view of the second coming, we will say that the second coming is yet future. That is not meant to be an all-encompassing condemnation, but it is just not simply the overwhelming view of the church through the years, and does directly contradict some core tenets not only of the second coming, but of the resurrection of the living and the dead, of judgment, the Great Commission, and more. Yes, Grant?
Yeah, I've not read the manuscript. I think some of us may have read the manuscript. Does Geisler mention anything about, because my understanding was that full preterism was condemned as heresy ecumenically by some of the early councils.
So I thought that as well, and I looked into it, and I could not find a church council that condemned it. Geisler does not treat preterism all that much in his presentation, but I had heard that myself, and I was trying to find that, and I just simply couldn't find it. I have seen certain denominations, like Presbyterianism, for example. At least I can't speak for all Presbyterians, but there were some high-level Presbyterian councils that did themselves condemn it as full preterism, as heresy. But I couldn't find one of like the historic Catholic Church at some church council. So it could be, but I couldn't find it. The other two views of the second coming prophecy are thought to be generally within orthodoxy, and the other two views are partial preterism and futurism. Partial preterism is as it sounds. To varying degrees, those in this camp think that many of the prophecies thought to be surrounding the end times, the tribulation, etc., occurred at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but not all prophecies, some yet remain future. Most notably, many of the prophecies of the end of Daniel, Matthew 24, and the resurrection and judgment and the establishing of the new heavens and the new earth that occur in the last 3 chapters of Revelation, they view yet future. A partial preterist would say that many of the events of Revelation are historical and have happened, but a couple major and final prophecies remain to be fulfilled. They affirm the bodily resurrection of the living and the dead, the physical resurrection of the living and the dead. I wrote that twice for some reason. And a final judgment in a future paradise. Thus, this would be considered to be a view within Christian orthodoxy and is believed by many Christians to this day. There are many diverse views within this subset. Many Christians can agree to have grace on the varying interpretations on this issue. But essentially, some in much of the book of Revelation has taken place, and you find it with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but they would not throw out the end of Revelation, which is the final resurrection and judgment, the great white throne judgment, and the establishment of the new heavens and the new earth. And to that end, the Great Commission as well. So this is an orthodox and historic view within the church. The final category of thought relating to the end times and second coming prophecy is the futurist. Simply put, they think that most of the prophetic writing of the New Testament and some notable prophecies in the Old Testament have yet to see their historical fulfillment. They generally think that the time of Jacob's trouble and tribulation of Revelation, the Antichrist, the resurrection of the living and the dead, the millennial kingdom, the final judgment, and the establishing of the new heavens and new earth are yet future. This is certainly a predominant view within the American church over the centuries, and is also considered an orthodox view within Christianity. And it also has varying and diverse views within it. So, to recap the three categories of thought about the end times and the second coming prophecy, preterism is a view affirming generally all prophecy has been fulfilled in the past, considered by many to be an unorthodox view. Partial preterism, a view that a great many of the prophecies have been fulfilled, but the final prophecies of Christ's return, resurrection of the dead, final judgment, and new heavens and new earth remain yet future, considered within orthodoxy. And finally, futurism, the idea that much or all of the book of Revelation, as well as many other prophecies, remain future, including the essentials mentioned above in partial preterism, plus others like the tribulation, a future Antichrist, and the millennial kingdom remain still future. So this is also considered within orthodoxy. And these accepted categories would also put us at distinction with the preterist views of the unorthodox groups such as Jehovah's Witnesses and Baha'i Faith, which think that the second coming has occurred already. So within those three categories, we'll pause here for a second. If questions or anything before we move on to the other three categories relating to the timing of the second coming. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? That was at the same time. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, not me.
Oh, go ahead.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, I haven't heard a good name put to it, but I've met people before that believe that basically it was fulfilled as a typology, for lack of better terms, at the destruction of the temple, but then it will also be accomplished to its full extent in the second coming. Most of like those non-essential doctrines. So almost like a partial preterist and a futurist, like they believe they were fulfilled both of those times. So like that you will have an antichrist, but that was also represented in the 70s, kind of like same thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the Old Testament mirrored in Jesus' death and resurrection. It's the same idea of that. I'm wondering if there's a more formal name for that or thoughts on that.
I don't know. But I understand what you're saying, and I think you kind of see that happen in Scripture, where you have like you have a prophecy, you have a partial fulfillment, and then you have like an ultimate fulfillment. And so, and there's a lot of debate about that stuff. I think Passover is like a great example of it. I think you see the Passover lamb come, which is like a great fulfillment of it, and then I think there's still probably a future fulfillment of the Passover lamb still yet coming. But there's a lot of things like that where you see, you see the prophecy, you see some fulfillment of it, and then you see like a total fulfillment of it. So it would not surprise me if, the destruction of the temple and stuff like that also was casting a shadow forward toward something else. I think that, I don't know what the name of that viewpoint would be, but I think that sounds like it would be pretty within orthodoxy. I don't know if anybody else knows what the name of that.
Partial preterism. I've just heard people call themselves partial preterists.
Right.
Say it in that way.
Yeah. Well, it would.
There's so many views on how to combine the different interpretations of Revelation at the latest almost get.
Who was the guy a few weeks ago that did a depravity?
Jimmy.
Yeah, so he said that somebody asked him an eschatology question, and he said that he grew up dispensationalist, but what he thinks, he didn't say that he wasn't or was anymore. I don't really know where he lands, but he sounded like he was saying that. He sounded like he was saying when you look at Revelation, he was saying it seems like Revelation could be read allegorically and referred to the church and referred to church history and referred to spiritual truths of Christ in the heavenlies and all those kinds of things. And he goes, but also, he's like, it could be the case that it is something that is symbolic or typology and could be pointing forward to a literal these events happening. I don't know. I mean, he sort of was like making a PB&J out of all of it, but
Yeah.
I was like, oh, we never thought about it like that
Mhm.
before.
Yeah, that's interesting. Josh, you had a question?
I mean, I was just gonna say, with regard to like full preterism being heresy, I would agree that to my knowledge, there's no church council that definitively said this is heresy,
Mm.
these specific beliefs are. But I think that there are several instances where it's de facto excluded from orthodoxy. Probably the most prominent is the Nicene Creed. I mean, if you look at the Nicene Creed, the final article on Christ says, "He will come again with glory to judge the living and the dead, his kingdom will have no end."
Yeah.
And that article refers to a future literal second coming.
Yeah.
Where judgment will happen on that day. It will in the future. Not saying it's already happened completely
Yeah.
in 70 AD.
Yeah. Yeah. That's perfect. Yeah, that's a good note there, because it definitely is at odds with many core tenets that have been like the historic view of the church. So anyway, yeah, that's good. That's a good note. Any other thoughts on that? We'll jump into the next 3 categories. Cool. So on to another threefold division relating to the timing of the second coming. These views all affirm the second coming and would be generally derivative of the 2 categories that we established within orthodoxy. So these 3 views are, as to the general timing of the second coming, are generally either partial preterist or futurist, and with all, of course, plenty of nuance and diversities within them, and they are again considered orthodoxy as well. So the 3 categories are premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. Amillennialists sometimes prefer to be called realized millennialists, but for simplicity's sake, we will just say amillennial. So these categories refer generally to when they expect the second coming to be. So if you get confused as to what each believes, just think of them in reference to the timing of the second coming, and it will help. So when do they think the second coming occurs? Premillennials think the second coming is before the millennial kingdom, hence premillennialism. Postmillennials think the second coming occurs after the millennial kingdom, postmillennials. And amillennial, meaning no millennium, think that the second coming is not in direct reference to the timing of the millennial kingdom, as they think the establishment of this kingdom is a spiritual one and has already been realized and is happening now. So, premillennialism, start there, is a futurist view of prophecy, pointing back to the other categories. It's the futurist view that believes the second coming of Christ that it is the second coming of Christ that kicks off a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ seen in the end of Revelation. Millennial means 1,000 years, and they take this to be literal. It is the return of Christ and his appointment as the physical king reigning in Jerusalem that will reign for 1,000 literal years. And at the end, Satan will be loosed, a final battle will take place, the resurrection of all people, and the final judgment will take place, and then the new heavens and the new earth will come, and our eternal state will be ushered in. This is a more literal interpretation or hermeneutic of the prophetic events. If you take most of the events of Revelation to be mostly chronological, this is how it seems to be laid out chronologically in Revelation. Not everybody agrees that you're to read Revelation chronological, but premillennials do broadly believe that, and so it's kind of laid out in that chronological order. So Within this camp, there are basically two groups, historical premillennials and dispensationalists. We won't get into the difference there, but if you hear those two terms, that's the group that the subcategory might be dispensationalist, the category above that would be a premillennialist, and the category above that would be a futurist, generally speaking, as we're kind of walking through the layers of this. And if you want to get even more specific, you can have pre-trib and post-trib and mid-trib and all that as subcategories even of that. But
It's really only the futurists that get that wacky in some of the divisions though. Like,
you're right, yeah, it's just the futurists that
because
have.
they have stuff that hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
So they feel that there's a lot of categories that they're trying to fit.
Right. So pre-trib and mid-trib and post-trib and the rapture and all that stuff, all that happens under the futurist category and the premillennial category. The other ones aren't worried about
Yeah, the
all
other
that
ones are
stuff.
extreme ones.
Yeah, they're just like, what are you guys talking about? Just, So yeah, it's within these groups that we get those sort of categories, the mid-trib and pre-trib and all that. We won't get into all of that. But basically, premillennials, that Christ comes pre the millennia. Christ comes, he is reigning as king of the millennial kingdom, a literal 1,000-year kingdom. He reigns from Jerusalem on earth with literal people. And then at the end of that, there's a final battle. And then after that is the final white throne judgment. And then the new heavens and new earth. Basically, that's the general view. Postmillennials think that much of the tribulation passages that we see in Revelation occurred in 70 AD. So they would be, a postmillennial will be under the umbrella of the partial preterist camp. They think that we have passed that part of the book of Revelation, the tribulational parts of the book of Revelation. They think we've passed that part and are in rather the millennial kingdom part of the book. So the beginning is all the tribulation and destruction and all these things. That's already taken place. That happened in 70 AD. But now we're kind of in the millennial kingdom part of the book, which comes next. And so they don't generally believe in the physical reign of Christ on earth, but rather a spiritual reign of Christ. But they do believe in a physical millennial kingdom on earth, just not a literal 1,000-year kingdom. So premillennials believe both in the physical bodily reign of Christ on the earth and that it's an actual kingdom. And the postmillennial would say it's not a bodily reign of Christ on the earth, but it is a physical kingdom of Christ that reigns on the earth, the millennial kingdom.
Because the church is physical? Like the church is physical? Like
Right,
that's why, okay.
right. It's like the idea of Christendom. That's the church on earth, basically, in the millennial kingdom. Christendom is the kingdom. And so it's not a literal 1,000 years. They believe that the world can and will be Christianized, and that the arc of history bends toward Christendom. They believe that it is the gradual Christianizing of the world that will precede the second coming of Christ. So they think that Christendom will establish a millennial kingdom for Christ, over which Christ will reign spiritually. So Christendom is the millennial kingdom for Christ, over which Christ reigns spiritually. They often call themselves the optimistic eschatology, because they believe that the Christian argument will win in the end, and that much of the world will be won for Christ. And when that occurs, Christ will return, and there will be resurrection, final judgment, and a new heavens and a new earth. So Christ will return physically post the millennial reign, which is the Christendom kingdom reign on the earth. It's the gradual Christianizing of the world. Christ returns after the millennial kingdom. It's the millennial kingdom part of the book of Revelation that we're in right now. This is a more spiritual, interpretive lens than the premills, but it's not as spiritualized as the amillennialists, generally speaking. So on the spectrum, the futurists, premillennials are a more literal, interpretive lens, and the post-trib would be more spiritual and allegorical than the premills, but they're not as allegorical and spiritual interpreting as the amills. So they're kind of like a happy middle. Again, the upper umbrella would be partial preterists, and under that umbrella you'd have post-millennials and amillennials, which we'll get to next. So that leaves the amillennial, or the realized millennial is their preferred term these days. They believe that the age of the millennial kingdom has been realized, that this is a spiritual kingdom in which that this is a spiritual kingdom which Christ reigns on the earth through the church. So Satan's power has been bound by Christ's work on the cross. So that part of the book of Revelation, the binding of Satan and these sorts of things, has already taken place. Christ and his work on the cross has bound Satan's power. Christ has reclaimed all authority and rules over the earth in power. So when Christ took back over everything, that was him taking back the kingdom. That was the millennial kingdom in a spiritual sense. And he instead of the premills think that he dwells physically on the earth in a physical kingdom, the post-mills think that he reigns spiritually in a physical kingdom, and the amills would say he reigns spiritually in a spiritual kingdom. And so you kind of you can see how the hermeneutic kind of gets you to each one of those, depending on how you come to interpret Scripture. So, and then the blessings that come and that are described within the millennial age in the book of Revelation, you see all the stuff about them living under the kingship of Christ, and all the blessings and all the stuff that come of that is now. It's the church age, and those are promises for you, and that you, as you read the book of Revelation, you should be encouraged, because all of the evil and horrible things has already been done, and that the promises of the millennial kingdom and the reign of Christ are for you today. And so you should take encouragement that those things are true in your life here right now. We're not waiting for something yet future. The future is here. And so they would say that we are under the lordship of Christ, the kingship of Christ now, and that no one knows the time or the season of the second coming of Christ, but it doesn't pertain particularly to the 1,000-year millennial literal reign. It's more of a spiritual reign that's ongoing, and they wouldn't believe in a literal 1,000 years either. But they do believe that he will come back again. They do believe that so there will be a second coming of Christ. They do believe that in the resurrection of the living and the dead. They believe in the judging of the righteous and unrighteous, all the stuff happening at the end of the book of Revelation, and the ushering in of the new heavens and the new earth. So that's generally the three categories, subcategories of the timing of the second coming of Christ. All I have left is just kind of to wrap it up. We can pause there for a second in questions and comments and that sort of thing. Anybody? Oh, come on, I know somebody's got a thought about pre-mill, post-mill, amill, or you just took...
The risk of sabotaging your ecumenism, who's right
He says at the risk of sabotaging your baptism, like, let's just destroy it.
Who's right?
Pick a side.
Who's wrong? Who's wrong?
Yeah, we'll just start with who's wrong
A
first.
better question, how many tons does the beast in Revelation weigh?
Yeah.
And which ocean does he come out of?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's we'll just get into an interpretive discussion about the book of Daniel and all that right after this. No, what do you think?
Literally no idea.
You don't have it.
Like the only hard opinion I have is the rapture isn't the thing. I don't think that's real.
You don't think the rapture exists?
Yeah.
Based.
That's like the only hard opinion I have.
Mm-hmm. Which would put you in what camp?
I don't know.
What camp would it put you out of?
Pre-trib for sure. Mid-trib
Put you out of that whole
It
discussion.
put me out of like all the pre-millennials.
Yeah, it puts you out of the premillennial camp.
Maybe not the like historical millennium camp.
The historic, to my knowledge, the historic premills still believe in a rapture, but it's most of the time it's post-tribulational.
So then what do you call the church fathers that didn't profess a belief in the rapture but still believe that Christ would return before the millennium?
I don't know, but I'm just talking about kind of in the modern camps now.
I'm Muller falls in the category of being in that.
He's a historical premill. Dr. Michael Brown is a historical premill and would be a post-tribulation rapture sort of guy. So there might be, I'm sure there is other views, but generally the premill categories are the ones that you see rapture and that sort of thing.
I think my only hard opinion on Revelation is like getting into discussions about trying to figure out the order of things is kind of silly. Then it kind of, I'm kind of the opinion that the eschatology talk in most of the New Testament, not that it's not real, but just that the point of it is to obey now, not later. Like Christ is here now.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff. I think perhaps some of the confusion is part of the design, and that God is maybe didn't give us all the answers because of two reasons. One is that part of the process is you diving in and trying to figure it out, and if it was right there in your face, you would never do it. And so maybe God has a little bit veiled because he wants you to be interested and dive into the scriptures and try to illuminate them for yourself and find answers. And it's that process of doing that is giving you spiritual growth. And so I'm amenable to that on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think what's interesting is that the different beliefs, just broadly on all kinds of stuff, but eschatology included, they drive like different orthopraxy within the church. So different doctrine leads to different practice. And so what you see with the premills a lot, and under a subheading under premills, you'll get to the charismatics. And the charismatics, it's their eschatology that makes them the most missionally minded group out of all of us. I mean, the charismatics are the people most missionally minded. Most of the converts and these sorts of things that are happening overseas is coming out of the charismatic church. And it is a result of their eschatology. They think that, that Christ is coming when the Great Commission is fulfilled. And so they're going to go out and they're going to make sure every tribe, tongue, and nation has the gospel, and then Christ's second coming will come. And so it drives that. On the other end, the postmillennials think that the world is going to be gradually Christianized, and so they want to build institutions. They want to take over parts of culture and win them for Christ. They want to have media companies, and they want to have podcasts, and they want to make TV shows, and they want to be politicians, and they want to effectuate change, and it drives them to do a really good job of discipling and of family structure. If you listen to premills, I mean, they're really big on creating family and passing on generational glory, and because postmills, because they have a long-term vision. They think it's not going to get worse until Christ comes back. It's actually going to get better, and so we're just going to keep working because we know we're going to win, and that in the end our argument's going to win. So we're going to build for the long term, and so I think God uses that for glory too. And so it's just kind of interesting. These things matter. They do change your orthopraxy, your practice. But I think, it's possible God is just using all of it to achieve his aims, because we should be as missionally minded as the charismatics, and we should have a long-term vision of cultural success too, and of family and generational wealth too. And so just perhaps that God just uses some of this to spur us on toward his ultimate goals.
Maybe the Protestant movement.
Right.
Like that we can still have unity as a movement and have all these wildly different positions and then affect change in a God-glorifying way.
Right. And if we can actually appreciate what the other camps are doing because of their belief system, then we can have genuine unity that I was talking about. If you're a post-mill and you're happy and glad, and by the way, I've heard some of them talk like this. Doug Wilson, for example, said, I think what the charismatic doing is an absolute good for the world. And he's not a charismatic, but he thinks the fact that they go out and make disciples and evangelize and are missionally minded is a great thing. And if you can appreciate that, then they're no longer your enemy. You realize that they're on your side and they have strengths in their line of thinking as well, even if you don't agree with them. And vice versa. So if we can actually appreciate our differences and what they spur us on to do, I think we can actually find some genuine unity at the bottom of all this, instead of just slinging stones at one another all the time. So what do you think? What do you think my position is, given my layout? I'm curious to see if I showed my hand.
I don't think you should. I mean, I was there for the Israel discussion.
So, yeah, fair. Which one?
Premillennialism.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the praise.
The prees.
All of them.
Yeah, I'm the pre.
Literally all of them.
But I'm glad it didn't come through too over the top.
No, not at all.
So,
I know which one I was pulling for.
you knew which one you were pulling for? Which one was it?
Pre.
You were pre. Okay, all right, cool. We got a friend there. So, as you explore whatever you believe on these issues, I'm just going to point you to. Oh, sorry, I just was fiddling with your mic. I just probably ruined the sound quality there. I'll point you to some passages that are commonly in view when we're talking about the second coming of Christ. I'm just going to point you to them. Matthew 24, that's a big one, talking about Christ coming on the clouds with fire. And so that's one of the ones in view when you're looking at this. Zechariah 12 through 14, I think mirrors Matthew 24. The language is strikingly similar, and I think Zechariah 12 through 14 is a great passage. That's where I derive a lot of my premillennialism from, because I think there's just stuff happening in Zechariah 12 through 14 that we haven't seen, that the enemies surround Israel, and they look upon the one that they have pierced, and they mourn and weep bitterly for him, and then he comes and puts his foot down on the Mount of Olives, and he fights for them. And
Unless
then
the church is Israel.
right. Well, I don't know that that's literally happened either to the church, but in a spiritual sense, yeah, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah.
And so if you take that somewhat literally, then that would point you kind of in one way. And then the second half of the book of Daniel, the second half of the book has a lot of stuff regarding Christ's second coming. And then the whole book of Revelation. Revelation is kind of like the culmination of all of that into sort of one thing. And so there's a lot of ways to read Revelation. We got to see it over the summer. We got two very different views of how to read the book of Revelation from your speakers. And so there's a lot, there's a lot of different opinion. But, at the end of the day, we're responsible for seeking Christ, the best we can, using the faculties that he's given us to reason, to seek wise counsel, and to try to grasp him in the best way that we can. But ultimately, if God wanted us to know him perfectly, He would not have given us a finite mind that could not possibly wrap around the fullness of the nature of God. And so we are meant to seek after him. We are meant to have good theology and doctrine and practice. These are very important things, but we are to love one another. We are to employ the fruits of the Spirit. And these things truly are primary. And Jesus says it to his disciples, who he was training theologically and rigorously. But he said, you will be known by your love for one another. And so character has always been more important. I don't think there's going to be a theology quiz on the entrance to the pearly gates. I don't believe that. And so that doesn't mean it's not important. It definitely is. It affects your practice in your life. But we need to unite, and especially as this culture shifts away from us. Where there's no longer going to be hiding as a cultural Christian. As cultural Christianity sort of crumbles, you're going to have to take a stand, and you're going to look across the bow at somebody who's a amillennial and you're a premillennial, and you're going to have to stand side by side and fight the culture issues of today, and to stand for righteousness in God's God's vision for how we are to be and to act in this time. So we keep those things as primary. We keep those things knowing that all this stuff is interesting and should be studied, and you should have an opinion on it. But let's not divide over these sorts of things. Let's stick to the essential doctrines so that we don't lose track of where we are, and then let's love one another and unite. So that's basically all I got. Good? Thank you. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns? You can turn it off if you want. All right. I got out of here.